Hello. If you don't know me, my name's Joe, and I'm about to discuss the history of Israel-Palestine. The reason I'm doing this is because, obviously, there's a war going on in Gaza. Israel's committing atrocities, and I think a lot of people would like more context, that see what's going on and know instinctively that something's wrong, but don't feel confident maybe taking action because they don't feel they have the full context. I've been told by a couple of people it would be useful to know more. It happens to be the thing that I probably know more about than anything else in the world. So I thought I'd make a video. I floated the idea to a couple of people. They said they thought it'd be useful. So here I am doing it. It is going to be a one-off. Don't worry. This isn't going to be a regular podcast. I'll leave that to the other white guys. There's plenty of them doing that. This is just one-off video. That does explain why the setup is a little bit rudimentary. I'm sorry if the sound isn't kind of as nice and high fidelity as you normally get when you listen to proper podcast videos. But there you go. I don't know how long it's going to take. I've got some general notes that I'll be speaking to, but I haven't written a script or anything. I will be breaking it down into chapters, so if it turns into quite a long video, you will be able to kind of dip in and out and easily find where you're at. Also, I will be fact-checking. As I say, I'm going to be speaking sort of off the top of my head from what I just generally know from some basic notes. I will check what I say afterwards, and if I've made a mistake somewhere, I'll kind of flag it in the video and there'll be notes below. So you can trust kind of what I say, even though I'm not reading to a script. I'll start by introducing myself. My name's Joe, as I say. This is primarily for people who know me, but if you don't, I'm a person who lives in Bristol. I'm quite a left-wing person. I've been politically active most of my life. I went on my first demonstration when I was 4. You can probably see the poster behind that shoulder. This is my bedroom, obviously, which is a reprint from one of the famous posters from the 1968 Paris uprising that I bought from the Working Class History store that funds their work, which I'll link to as well, actually, in case you want one. I've been politically active all of my life in various things, anti-fascism, environmental stuff. I've done some animal rights things. I was part of the Labour Party when it was good. I've done some community organising, done some general anti-war activism. But the thing that I've probably done more of than anything else would be Palestine solidarity activism. And that's because although I'd kind of been going to demonstrations and stuff in my teenage years, the thing that really made me committed to becoming like committed to always doing something to try and bring about social change in one shape or other was when I went to Palestine in my early 20s. I did some solidarity activism over 2 trips with a group called the International Solidarity Movement. I spent 6 months there on my first trip and 3 on the second, and I was involved with the group and wider Palestine activism back in the UK for many years as well. So I have read a lot about this. I do know a lot. I'm telling you all this as well because I want to be honest about my biases. I think more people should be. Everyone has them. People that say they're, neutral about stuff are often lying. It's hard to be neutral, and there's a lot of information online, misinformation, especially kind of now put out by kind of grifters who hide who they really are and what their real agenda is. I just want to be open about that. I am putting this out there in order to inform people more so that they feel more empowered to take action for Palestine. I'm a pro-Palestinian person. I support the Palestinians. I think it is a very black and white, one-sided issue, and I'll kind of explain why. That doesn't mean I'm not going to be kind of fair. I do, as part of being involved in Palestine activism, I have been exposed to all of the arguments that people that support Israel make, and I will reference them and kind of answer back to them as we kind of go on through the video. In fact, actually, one of the first things I did before I went to Palestine was read a really terrible book that, through the magic of video editing, you'll see an image of right now, written by a terrible man called Alan Dershowitz, who's now disgraced because he was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, and it was edited by Natalie Portman, interestingly, or she assisted on it anyway. So I know what the pro-Israel line on different talking points throughout history are, and I will mention them and discuss them in the interest of fairness. Where to begin? There's various people jump into this story at different points. A lot of people miss out the ancient history because they want to recognise that it's not actually this like thousands of year old intractable conflict over religion. It's way more secular, it's way more solvable, it's way more normal, if you like, than that. And I totally agree with that, but there's still some context that is useful from ancient history. So Palestine, the Levant area around it as well, was part of the Fertile Crescent, part of one of the earliest places where human civilization took off. Judaism is one of the oldest religions in the world, up there with Hinduism. In case that changeover wasn't super smooth, as sometimes you see YouTubers do, I'm a bit ill at the moment and I just got into a coughing fit. So throughout this video, there might be little pauses where I will have stopped the recording and come back to it. Anyway, ancient history. The Old Testament happens. All of the events in that area. Moses, the stories. Jesus is born. Jesus lives his life in that area. AD 70. The Jews, people of Judea, have been fighting against the Roman Empire for a while. The uprising is finally crushed in this year. The temple is destroyed, and the Jews are expelled from Palestine, going on mostly to live in Europe. And the Roman Empire slowly turns to become Christian. There's various wars between Islam develops in Saudi Arabia. There's wars between Christians and Muslims over that area, crusades, etc., hundreds of years. One thing it's worth pointing out, because I don't know that if everyone actually knows this, but there's a direct kind of lineage between Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Christianity obviously came out of Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. But Islam wasn't a direct descendant in terms of the people who were Christians becoming Muslims. It was more complicated than that. But the faith itself, Muslims believe that all of the people featured in Christianity and Judaism were prophets, with Muhammad being the final prophet. So they're linked. It's like a lineage. Depends where you kind of stop, with Islam being the final one. As I say, it's important not to fall into the trap of thinking that this is an intractable religious conflict that can't be solved because people are so dogmatic about their religious beliefs. But it is important to realise that because it involves people of the three Abrahamic faiths, there's a lot of shared religious sites. And those are like resources, essentially, that are huge points of contention, specifically in Jerusalem. But the real history, kind of starts in the mid-19th century. The Ottoman Empire has been in charge for 400 years-ish, 350, 400 years at this point. As empires go, I'm not out here saying that the Ottoman Empire was some wild paradise, but it was pretty hands-off in its affairs. The rulers tended to just sit in Istanbul, collecting their rent, and Palestine was kind of a little bit of a backwater in the 19th century. The Palestinians had lived there, people that can trace their lineage back to that time, and the hundreds of years before, they had been mostly tenant farmers of the Ottomans for hundreds of years, just living their life without too much direct interference from the Ottomans. The first wave of Jewish immigration into Palestine, it's called the first Aliyah, which means rising up, I think. Another thing I'll check. If I've got that wrong, there'll be a note about that. Is in the mid-19th century, and it isn't particularly organised, and it isn't with any aim of setting up a Jewish state. It's a mix of people coming from different places in Europe, some for religious reasons, wanting to go back to the Holy Land, some fleeing anti-Semitism. But it's a slow drip. There's always been a small indigenous Palestinian Jewish population throughout the whole time. At the very start of this, as 2% of the Palestinians are Jewish, maybe like 20% Christian, and the rest Muslim. That kind of starts off in the mid-19th century, but Zionism as a political movement, an organised movement to set up a state in Palestine, which is now Israel, in the area that, historic Palestine, really starts kind of at the end of the 19th century. There's a few factors behind this. One, there was an incident called the Dreyfus Affair. In France, there was a military officer called Richard Dreyfus who was Jewish, and I won't go into all the details of it, but he was treated incredibly unfairly, and it was seen as a sign of rising anti-Semitism, and that the French Republic, even though it had been this supposedly revolutionary, free place, anti-Semitism could kind of still exist. Which was shocking to people because France had been pretty free of anti-Semitism for a while, and it made Jewish people some Jewish people in Europe think that nowhere can ever be safe permanently. Even if you think that a country has been stable and safe for a period of time, anti-Semitism can come back at any point, and it made some people decide that they wanted to set up a Jewish state somewhere that was separate and out of Europe. The first Zionist Congress was like 1897, led by someone called Theodor Herzl. It took place in Basel in Switzerland. The other bit of context to this was that this was really in the height of colonialism in the West. People tend to think sometimes colonialism was this like slow or kind of steady linear process, but it actually really kind of accelerated through the centuries as technology and capitalism and whatnot advanced. And before the Second World War kind of bankrupted all of the Western nations and stopped them being able to hold on to the colonies that they had, there was an intense period of new colonisation. What was called the Scrabble for Africa happened around that time, late Victorian, early 19th century. So this kind of thinking is in society at this time. And as I say, it was mixed with the idea that Jews cannot be safe anywhere. Throughout the preceding centuries, I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism kind of now. Jews have been incredibly persecuted for hundreds and hundreds of years throughout Europe. What we see now, the dynamics you see with ruling elites blaming problems that they cause themselves on foreigners, immigrants, or whatever, that is common today. Jews served that function for hundreds of years throughout the entirety of Europe. There were untold massacres, expulsions from everywhere across Europe. The word pogrom means, it's like massacre, and there were a lot of them. Even in England, Jews were expelled in this year. The other dynamic was that Jews were often barred from certain professions, and could only work in certain professions. And some of them were money lending, and quite often kings, lords, whoever became quite indebted to certain Jewish people, and instead of paying their debts, they would kind of kill or expel the Jews. Incredible levels of persecution for hundreds of years, as I say. In 1492, Jewish people were expelled completely from Portugal, and those people spent hundreds of years living kind of in Muslim countries, which was actually way better. As a kind of context, up until 1948, which I'll get to, it wasn't perfect, but Jewish people who are known as the Sephardim, who went on to live in Muslim countries, were treated much fairly and were not persecuted anywhere near as much as what happened in Europe, which is something to bear in mind considering the dynamics of today. That's in comparison to Ashkenazi Jews, which is the name for Jewish people from Western Europe, who are lighter skinned. Like me, I'm a quarter Jewish. My grandfather was Jewish. My surname should be Leibovitz. My great-grandparents came over from Romania in the 1920s. So that is the context in which the Zionist movement has formed. There's been some natural general immigration into Palestine. It's the height of colonialism. Colonialism is seen as something normal. Jews have been historically persecuted for centuries in Europe, and the Dreyfus Affair has made people think that some people think that this is an intractable problem. It wasn't always Palestine that they were going to sort of settle on. That was talked about at the first conference. Other destinations were mooted, but the historical ties, obviously, and the fact that some people had already started moving there made them decide on Palestine. It's really important to sort of note that from this point, right up until the establishment of the State of Israel, Zionism was always kind of a minority movement amongst the Jewish population of Europe. That did change with the Holocaust, but at this point, it was minority. People didn't want to go. People wanted to stay in Europe and fight for their rights. There was an organisation called the Bund that still exists today, which was a really strong, big network of Jewish leftists who were anti-Zionist, who believed heavily in just fighting for their rights in Europe. Some people had a religious objection to it. If you're ever confused by seeing Orthodox Jewish people at Palestine demonstrations, a lot of them are from orders who view Zionism, the idea that Jews should go and set up a state in Israel, as against the Torah, that it shouldn't happen until the Messiah comes. And they believe in Palestinian human rights as well, but that's why they have a religious objection to it as well. And in the UK, their order's called the Naturai Charta. There are other Orthodox sects as well that also have the same belief. They realised very early on that they were going to need backing of a great power to achieve this. And good old Blighty was at the height of Britain's powers at the time, was the main power. I think, shamefully, our country has invaded 90% of the countries in the world, and the turn of the 20th century was the height of all of that. So they were petitioning Britain to become a kind of sponsor of this project from very kind of early on. They achieved that in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration by a government minister called Lord Balfour that Britain would commit to helping establish a Jewish state in Palestine. It's worth noting that Balfour himself was an anti-Semite. You can be a Zionist, and I'm just going to kind of define that term a little bit. Actually, there's some circles here, but I think before the establishment of the State of Israel, the term Zionist would mean somebody who wanted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Afterwards, it's somebody who kind of takes the pro-Israel point of view, believes that Israel has a right to maintain itself as an ethnocracy for one people and not another, and generally takes a pro-Israel point of view. I try not to use it wherever possible. You can use it kind of just accurately, like you can. I prefer the term like supporters of Israel or something like that, because there are people out there who are anti-Semitic. Like in the movement, I challenge anti-Semitism when I see it. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. At the demonstration last Friday, me and a friend and someone else chased a guy down the road who shouted "F the Jews." Right? It's not prevalent. It's not like everywhere, but it does exist. And sometimes people do use the word Zionist when they mean Jewish. Not everybody that uses the word Zionist to mean supporter of Israel does that, but some people do. So I prefer not to use that term if possible. But certainly when you're talking about before the establishment of the State of Israel, where there was no state, that's the term. So Balfour was a Zionist and he was an anti-Semite. And those two things aren't as opposed as you might imagine. If you're somebody who doesn't like Jewish people, the idea that they might all go off somewhere else it's not incontractable with your worldview, and people need to realise that, because it does have implications in the modern age. One of the things that really frustrates me is that a lot of sort of pro-Israel, modern pro-Israel people who are anti-Semitic get a free pass on that anti-Semitism if they support Israel. There are countless examples of this. In the UK, let's just talk about the Tory party. Considering the attention that was on anti-Semitism in the 2019 election, are you going to be surprised to know that, did you know that Boris Johnson wrote a book where he said that Jews control the media? You probably didn't know that. You probably read a lot or saw a lot about anti-Semitism between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. Are you amazed that you didn't know that fact, that wasn't a thing? Or how about when the Tory party went into actual coalition with actual neo-Nazis, like in Europe in the early 2010s under David Cameron? No one cares. Or when he invited Viktor Orban. I can't remember, it might have been Johnson, Theresa May or Cameron, I'm not sure. One of them had Viktor Orban in Downing Street. Virulent anti-Semite. It had minuscule pushback, and that free pass I think is disgusting that people are given. But that's something to note that exists, and it was there from the beginning. Balfour himself, virulent anti-Semite. But the Balfour Declaration also sort of was a lie. So World War One sort of happens. The state of things at World War One was that Jewish immigration to Palestine had increased since it became an official political movement. People were able to buy land there because of absentee Ottoman landlords. They were dispossessing Palestinians because Palestinians generally were only tenant farmers because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. But that all came to a head in 1917 anyway, the end of World War One. Ottoman Empire fell. Although Britain had committed to establishing a Jewish state, it had also made a deal with France called the Sykes-Picot Agreement to carve up the Middle East for themselves. Jewish people the Jews were not the only, or Zionists were not the only ones who had been lied to. In fact, the British had got all of the sort of Arab peoples to fight on side during World War One by telling them the lie that they were going to offer them independence afterwards. In fact, there's a weird side note of history. The red, black, green, white flags that tend to make up different nation flags of Arabic countries. It was designed by the British to promote Arab nationalism, to get us on side. We've done a lot of really bad things. Lawrence of Arabia was the person that went around promising, stuff that was never delivered because of us and France's desire to carve up the Middle East for ourselves. We did terrible things in Iraq post World War One, but we were in charge of Palestine. So the British occupation, or mandate as it was called, began after World War One, and with the Balfour Declaration, the word was out. Up until then, Jewish people had been moving. There was some discontent amongst the Palestinian population that some people were being dispossessed from their lands, but it wasn't known that there was a group within that movement whose aim was a state to an ethnic state. But now with the Balfour Declaration, it was known. From a very tumultuous period. There were general strikes. There was a revolt of the Palestinians between 1936 and 39, which was kind of key because it left them unprepared for the war that came later. The immigration that happened, that was steady during that time, wasn't uniform either. There were some people coming over with like the official bodies. Some people came in as leftists and had a general idea that they wanted to set up like solidarity workers communes, but they were the minority. It was mostly get land, dispossess Palestinians. Even the kind of leftist, the communi kibbutzes, tended, to be like ethnocentric. It was colonialism, one people replacing another. The British, managed to quell every revolt. In the meantime, teaching the tactics that you see the Israeli state practicing today to the nascent Israeli army, the collective punishment that you're seeing of Gaza right now. That was a British colonial tactic, and that's where they learnt it from. This is not just something that's happened in Israel-Palestine. The legacy of British colonialism across the world is diffuse, but there are some patterns, and one of those patterns is that the terrible, horrific tactics that the British occupation used then get used by people within that land when they become oppressors afterwards. It all gets quite a lot though, and the Arab revolt of 36 to 39 does mean that Britain is makes a declaration that it's going to stop Jewish immigration into Palestine because the situation's getting out of hand. This causes then the Zionist movement to become embattled with the British for a short period. Then World War II happens. Post World War II, British policy is still to stop Jewish immigration into Palestine. Another fact that people don't know is that British policy after World War II, after the Holocaust, after everything that's known, after us going on about how good we are, the one good thing we've done in the world, the policy was to stop Jewish immigration into Britain from Germany. So our national story about what heroes we are for saving the world from the Nazis. We got into that war reluctantly because of a treaty with Poland that we didn't want to, and afterwards we treated the victims of the Holocaust despicably. We wouldn't even let them into Britain, and so the one good thing that we've done in history, are not even all that good. The policies continued there, and the bodies that would become the official Israeli army start a armed resistance campaign against the British in earnest. And the main force that becomes the Israeli army is called the Haganah. But there are offshoots who are more extreme who do practice terrorist tactics. They're called the Irgun and the Lehi. The most famous terrorist attack, if you define terrorist by an attack on civilians designed to get a political response, was the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. There were others, and one of the ironies when you're talking about Israel and Palestine is, the Zionist movement before they got their state employed lots of terrorist tactics. It's how they got what they wanted. So they can't claim that much moral victory. I'm not supporting terrorism. I don't support any attacks on civilians. Like I just want to say now that the Hamas attack on the festival was horrific, right? It doesn't justify what's going on in Gaza now, and that's why I'm making this video. But it was horrible. I'm not here defending terrorism, but the Israelis practiced it too. I mean, they practice it now, but like even before they had a state, they did it in the same form that Palestinians sometimes do it now. It's all got completely out of hand. The uprising and Britain was broke post World War II and just wanted out of there, and was just trying to hand it over to the international sort of community and the nascent kind of UN. 1947, the UN has a plan, a partition plan, and supporters of Israel will point to this quite a lot because it was accepted by the Zionist movement and was rejected by the Palestinians, and it's cited as evidence that Palestinians don't want peace. Look, they didn't even accept the plan in 1947. I'm going to put some maps up. You're going to get the chance to stop looking at my face in a moment, so you can see what was kind of on offer. If you compare it to the amount of Jewish people and the amount of Palestinians that are in that land anyway, it was completely unfair. All of the best land went there. Palestinians were perfectly reasonable to reject that plan. It was also pretty well known that wouldn't have stopped things. Ben Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister, has said publicly that if they would have accepted that plan, that would have just been the jumping off point, and that they would have continued to try and take the rest of the land afterwards. So there's a civil war after this plan is rejected between Palestinian kind of irregulars who have been depleted during the 39 revolt as well, and the Zionist movement. Israel declares independence, which sparks neighbouring Arab countries who fairly recently have got together to form an Arab League to declare war on Israel, which they lose badly. The war ends with the situation with the borders as you kind of see them today. Like the armistice lines are what become the borders of Israel proper, or what Israel has like a recognised kind of like right to exist in, and what are like the occupied territories. The Gaza Strip exists because it was just the last little strip that the Egyptian army was kind of holding on to at the end of that war. The West Bank exists in its form as it is because that's the hilly area, and that will be important later, and I will be discussing that. But yeah, basically the fighting ends where the hills start. Geography often plays more into politics than people kind of realise, but that's why it is. It ends with 700 Palestinians displaced and out of historic Palestine. It was claimed for a long time that they left of their own volition. This is the Israeli propaganda. It's now established it was ethnic cleansing. There was a new historians movement in the 1980s of Israeli historians who proved pretty conclusively that an ethnic cleansing took place during that war and like afterwards. And this event is what's known by Palestinians as the Nakba, which means catastrophe. One of the things people who support Israel say is that, Palestinians, they're using this word Nakba. They say that the establishment of the State of Israel was a catastrophe. That's not what they mean. They mean the ethnic cleansing that took place. And they remain the biggest refugee population in the world. They still have refugee status, and their descendants, since 1947, people have been living in refugee camps. A lot of people still have, you see the thing, people have the key to the home that they were ethnically cleansed from. It's a small area of land. Gaza starts off as, mainly just a refugee camp. A huge proportion of the Gazans are refugees, and they can see the land that they've been dispossessed from. They can see the houses that they were thrown out of and people living in there. For a long time, they could go back and work in Israel because there were better wages and just not live there. And that's been going on since 1947. That's why they say Nakba. It's one of the main issues to be resolved, and it's totally resolvable. But Israel needs to relent. But I will come to political solutions and why the fault lies. A solution has been found on Israel later. It's their legal right to return as well. One of the earliest resolutions the UN passes is UN Resolution 194, which asserts that Palestinian refugees have a right to return back to their homes at the earliest practicable date. And that's not passed, that's not changed. That's their legal, moral, everything right to go back and live in their ancestral homeland. And it's a right that hasn't been realised yet. So the situation post 1948 is Egypt is in control of Gaza. People are rapidly setting up refugee camps. There's a huge refugee population. And in the West Bank, Jordan is in control, has taken the West Bank. Palestinian Fedayeen, sort of irregular forces, are doing border attacks, but the two states are trying to stop them because they don't want to get into another war. The Palestinians inside Israel are living under martial law, and do for the first 20 years of Israel's existence. One of the things that supporters of Israel try to cite often is the fact that Palestinians in Israel can vote. They're like, oh, look, how can this be an apartheid state? Look at all these rights they have. Well, it's true. The Palestinians make up 20% of the population within Israel's official, recognised legal borders. But they lived under martial law for the first 20 years of the state's existence. They still live as third-class citizens today, and it's one of the key demands of the Palestinians, actually, which, again, I'll come to later. But it's worth remembering that, for the first 20 years of the state, they were under martial law. The next important event is the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Nasser, a nationalist leader, comes to power in Egypt and nationalises the Suez Canal, which does not please the imperial powers of the time. Britain, France, Israel go to war with Egypt. What's important is that America says stop it, and Britain has to kind of go along with it. And this is seen as the point where who is the most powerful nation on earth changes. Because America has told Britain what to do, this is the point where America is now the top dog in the world, the most important, the most powerful nation on earth. That's the point when it happens. It doesn't particularly change things within Israel-Palestine. The next big kind of thing that happens is the 1967 war. The PLO is founded before this, the Palestine Liberation Organization. You've probably heard of Yasser Arafat. But the 1967 war I won't go into why it started. It's disputed and it doesn't really matter. But Israel fought a lot of Arab armies from states surrounding it and did very well in the war. They call it the Six-Day War because they want to brag about how quickly they won it. They took the Sinai from Egypt, including and the Gaza Strip. They conquered the West Bank, and they took the Golan Heights from Syria. And these are what are now the occupied territories. When we're talking about the occupation, it's the longest running military occupation in the world. It's been going since 1967. Military occupations are supposed to be short. It's kind of like, America and stuff did in Germany post-war. There was no government because we'd overthrown the Nazis, and so you have to occupy for a bit and set something up and then you leave. They're not supposed to last this long. Palestinians in the occupied territories have never had any rights. East Jerusalem slightly different. So all of these rights that Israel says that Palestinians enjoy and why they're not an apartheid state, well, they've never applied to Palestinians in the occupied territories. And it's been going on since 1967, so it's pretty fair to say this is not a temporary state of affairs. The UN gets involved. There's a pretty clear solution. It's very, very clear. They passed UN Resolution 242, which states that Israel must give back the territories that it's conquered because post World War II, this is the setting up of like the international order where like there are now supposed to be rules to how to exist as a country and nation states. And one of those that's pretty clear is you can't take territory by force. They ban this. So Israel is not allowed to annex these areas. That's against the new order of things. The plan is Israel gives back territories, it gets recognised, peace happens. That was the idea. Pretty fair. They achieved that with Egypt. They give the Sinai back in 1979, and every year in the UN there has been a vote about whether this is still the framework for how a settlement should happen. That Israel gives back the territories it occupied in 1967 to set up an independent Palestinian state in exchange for being recognised and getting a peace treaty. There's a consensus around it. Every year in the UN, only America, Israel, and a few small Pacific Island nations that do what America tells it vote against it. Every year since '67. It's only American and Israeli intransigence that stops this from happening. It's worth at this point talking about Israel's relationship with America because this is where it changes in 1967. Before I do that, I am going to go back and mention the thing that is on my notes that I didn't mention, which is the Jews of what happened with Jews in Middle Eastern countries. And as I said, after being evicted from Portugal, a separate population of Jewish people lived in predominantly Muslim countries. They became known as the Sephardim. They generally, it's a long, hundreds of years, complicated history, but were far less persecuted than in Europe, lived very free in Muslim lands. That did change with the advent of Zionism, and there was there had been ethnic cleansing. After the Nakba, other Arab states responded by evicting their Jewish populations. This is unacceptable. Ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing. Whether it's in response to something or not, it has to be completely condemned and was an atrocity. It was slow and complicated. It wasn't one event, but the Jewish population of Middle Eastern countries has sort of dwindled, or like North African as well. Not to zero. Even in Iran, there is still a Jewish population, but not like there was. They predominantly go to Israel and become second-class citizens. I said Palestinians were the third-class citizens. Well, in the early state, a new ruling class is establishing itself, and like in Europe, it's tied quite often to race, and the Ashkenazi Jews become like the highest status race in the country, then Sephardic Jews and Palestinians. But Israel's relationship with America, it's easy to go wrong on this, and it's sensitive. It can quite seem at times like Israel has power over America, and this is really misguided. And it's really, you can get onto dodgy territory. There are people who I don't think are anti-Semites, but by kind of misreading this relationship can get into some quite dodgy ground when they talk about how Israel relates to America. The tail wagging the dog is the phrase. Yes, America gives Israel more military aid than any other country, more support, more diplomatic support than anyone. That is not because Israel controls America in a way. Israel is useful for American foreign policy. This relationship doesn't really solidify until after the 1967 war, after Israel's kind of proved itself militarily. As I said, it was a successful military campaign for them. And American has now established itself as a power, and the way it rules the world is slightly different to how, Britain and France and whoever did it. Old school colonialism, boots on the ground, taking resources, that's sort of out. They're still invading countries and things like that, but they don't have armies stationed like everywhere, like literally ruling things. It's imperialism, not colonialism. And the Middle East, where their oil is from, is the most important region for them to kind of control things politically, but from a distance compared to the colonial period. And having like a super loyal, super dependent, really militarily capable ally right in there, like an attack dog, is really useful for them. They also have the nuclear bomb. I can't remember which year Israel developed it. They haven't admitted to it, but everybody knows they have one. I'll do it, make it come up in numbers here. Was the year that, and that's why America supports Israel. It's not the power of Israel. And you can get swayed by seeing like AIPAC conferences, which is the main Israel lobby group in America, and see huge like politicians presenting there and stuff. But it's fundamentally America over Israel, America using Israel for its own foreign policy objectives. But it is super loyal to Israel. It's the one country that supports it in the UN, as I say, with the vote every time. And once we get to the peace process, bears a huge amount of responsibility for the failure of it, because it's not an honest broker. It's not neutral. It's a strong ally of Israel. So things go on. Israel refuses to, really engage with UN Resolution 242. It begins building settlements instead, completely illegal. You are not allowed to move civilian populations into military occupied area, but it wants to keep the land. It's got the West Bank now, which is important for it, as I say, because it's high up. Militarily, high ground is useful. That and they start solidifying their hold over it. It's where a lot of the resources are. And of course they take the whole of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem, where all of the main religious sites, is in East Jerusalem, and they have it now. Those three sites are the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, the big golden temple that you'll see. That's the third holiest site in Islam. It's the site where Muslims believe Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven from. And it's got the holiest church in Christendom, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christ was crucified. Incidentally, the Church of the Nativity is in Bethlehem, which is in the occupied West Bank. And the holiest site in Judaism, which is the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, which is the last remaining wall of the second Jewish temple before the Romans destroyed it. And they're all right on top of each other. And Jerusalem is one of the big issues. But again, I just wanted to underline the point that I made earlier that although Jerusalem and religious sites are like issues that are part of the conflict, that doesn't mean that this is just some like crazy, like intractable conflict between two, religion mad people. It's just another resource that people like need to find a way to share, and can very easily if Israel was to allow it. It's one of the things that sort of like sparks things periodically as well. Israel periodically stops Palestinians from being able to at least even visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a huge point of contention, and it's the start of the second Intifada starts there, which we'll come to later. But yeah, so the 70s go on. The PLO is kind of in Lebanon, waging guerrilla war across the border. This leads to a war, Israel invading Lebanon in the 1980s, 82, and with horrific consequences that too complicated to get into now. They did some horrific stuff there. They leave a kind of proxy army, and this is the start of Hezbollah. It's linked in with the Lebanese civil war. It's very complicated. But that's 82. But the main one, in terms of Palestine, the main effect of it is that the PLO are then exiled into Tunisia. They become far away. They're not even like around the borders like at all. They're far, far away. And it's this that leads the Palestinian population in the occupied territories, who have been quite passive at this point. Kind of sort of not relying, but like thinking that the fight for their independence is just happening elsewhere, to take matters into their own hands. And the first Intifada kicks off. Intifada means shaking off in Arabic, like uprising. And in the 80s, it was a truly popular uprising. It was spontaneous. It was not organised by the PLO or parties. It was largely kind of unarmed. It's where the image of the child throwing the rock at the soldier, kind of echoing the David and Goliath story, kind of originates from. People were demonstrating, people were boycotting, people were organising, people were doing direct actions, like non-violent direct actions. People were, as I say, throwing stones. Like there weren't guns really, and this won them a lot of support in the international community and put a huge amount of pressure on Israel. The attitude of the left around the world changed kind of at this point. Until then, because of the horrors of the Holocaust and everything like that, the left had been quite sympathetic to Israel. They'd also been taken in by Israeli propaganda about the kibbutz movement. I remember as a child, actually, as I say, I grew up in a house of leftists. My mum spent time in Israel, I think, in the 70s, and had visited kibbutzes. And I remember being in my between 5 and 10, being told about like these wonderful communes that existed, and how how great and egalitarian the kibbutzes are. They never really were. They were maybe egalitarian within themselves, but they were always like exclusionary of Palestinians. But and now today, even that has kind of gone. Neoliberalism's got its hold everywhere, and they're just businesses. But seeing the left starts to see the Palestinians as the underdog for the first time in the first Intifada, starts to realise what it is. It starts to realise it's colonialism, this is oppressed people, this is occupation, and solidarity starts to build in Western countries with them, and around the world more generally. One of the ways Israel relates to this, and this is fact. What I'm about to say sounds like crazy conspiracy theory, but it's fact. You can see Mehdi Hassan from The Guardian doing a video on the same topic, saying what I'm about to say. So it's I'm not making this up. Israel during this first Intifada encourages the formation of Hamas. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, in Egypt. And Israel wanted to destroy Palestinian unity, which at that time had been quite secular and based around secular nationalism, by creating divisions in society between kind of Islamists and secular nationalists. Government ministers have admitted this, that they funded organisations and they allowed sort of the proto-Hamas organisations that existed. It started kind of just as a non-political charitable thing, and that, you know, it was encouraged by Israel to create divisions in society. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation between that and today, and that it's all part of some master plan. I think they regret it now, to be honest. I think it's seen as along Israeli policymakers as a mistake, but they did it, and it's worth noting that happened in the first Intifada. But it also puts enough pressure on them that they have to come to the negotiating table, and the Oslo peace process starts from 1993, 30 years ago this year. It's obviously not very successful because it's been 30 years. The formula is well known. It's land for peace. Palestinians are going to get their own state based on the West Bank, Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and a solution found for the refugees in line with international law. That's, you know, the right of return. These are their rights. Israel's at the negotiating table. Unfortunately, America is there as well, and there is no even broker, and there's no real pressure on Israel to actually kind of do what it needs to do, to give up what it needs to give up from its point of view, to actually make peace. There's some people would claim that if Yitzhak Rabin hadn't been assassinated, the Israeli prime minister at the time, who was assassinated by a settler quite early on in the process, that he would have, made the concessions that were needed from their point of view to make peace. But I'm not sure I agree. But either way, he was killed, and the following prime ministers certainly didn't. They do not want to give up the whole of the West Bank. It's where a lot of the resources are, water, etc. It's where a lot of the fertile land for growing is in the Jordan Valley, and as I say, it's hilly. They want to keep hold of the hills that give them some kind of strategic advantage, militarily speaking. They do not want to give up Jerusalem, but they have to. This is their obligations, and they do everything they can to avoid this. The settlement program, there's sort of two aspects to it. As I say, it's been going on since the occupation began. You have state-sponsored settlements which are in like key strategic areas that are heavily invested and heavily built up with hugely subsidised housing. It's usually new immigrants to Israel that end up living there. And then you have the really ideologically driven settlers who go and set up outposts and places. The one city that they've moved into is Hebron, because that's where the Cave of the Patriarchs is, a shared religious space where that's holy to all Abrahamic faiths, because that's where the very early patriarchs are buried. And those are some of the most extreme settlers that you'll come across, and I'll talk about what the occupation is actually like later. But Israel makes a big deal of this generous offer that Ehud Barak apparently made to Yasser Arafat in 1999. The best offer that was imaginable. I'm going to put some maps up, at this point. You can stop looking at my face again. What the Palestinians are entitled to is 22% of historic Palestine. They're having even more of their historic homeland. What Israel was offering was a fraction of that, and it was fragmented. Israel's going to keep all of the settlement blocks and just give some kind of fairly empty desert land in exchange. Nelson Mandela, bit of an expert on these matters, described the plan as like Bantustans. These were self-governing like entities within apartheid South Africa that wasn't a real state, wasn't a real country. This was kind of this is all that's ever been on offer from Israel, is a Bantustan solution for the Palestinians. They get a few areas that they can pretend are self-governing, surrounded by Israel, controlled by Israel, with no real rights over Jerusalem, and no right of return for refugees, like a tiny limited number maybe. This is the best they've ever offered, and they will claim that this offer was made and it was rejected by the Palestinians who just want violence. But it was not good enough. It was not a way to live. It was not a viable Palestinian state. It was nowhere near what Palestinians are entitled to under international law. And so every single death, every single killing, including the massacre that happened at the music festival, from this point on is now on Israel. The past is the past, right? The past happened. You can debate whether Zionism was like justified because of historical Jewish persecution or whatever. You could, from this point on, from Oslo, is all like, it's just not even debatable. Like, the Palestinians have ineffable legal rights, and Israel is refusing to meet them, and that's all there is to it. It breaks down. The talks break down. Israel's not giving Palestinians what they entitled to. Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister, particularly bad one, makes a very provocative visit to the Temple Mount, the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The second Intifada kicks off, which is much more violent than the first one. The Palestinians, they didn't get what they needed through non-violent resistance and turned to violent resistance. It's worth noting during this period as well, just to really underline how intent Israel is to not concede what it needs to give what it needs to make peace. The settlement numbers double during this period of making peace, under supposedly kind of liberal prime ministers as well. Period with Netanyahu and Sharon excluded. Literally double, from a period of 1967 to 1993 versus 1993 to 1999, it doubles. The second Intifada is very violent. It's where you see all of the suicide bombings. If you were around in the early noughties, it was very in the news. It carries on. It peters out maybe about 2010. It goes on for a few years, maybe two. It's debated at what point it petered out. It's during it. There is a few important events before it happens. I missed something. Sorry, I missed something. I had my list, but I missed it. So during the Oslo peace process, the PLO recognised Israel. They gave Israel what Israel was supposed to get in exchange for giving up the territories and setting up the Palestinian state. They played their hand, and they became the Palestinian Authority that now administers kind of the West Bank, and often is subservient to Israel. From 2010 onwards, the hold of the PA over the West Bank intensifies, and I'll talk about that later. But the Palestinians did what they were supposed to make peace in the 90s, and they did not get what they were supposed to get in return. During the second Intifada, the BDS movement starts. This is why it's important from a international point of view, particularly, I think. In 2005, an unprecedented coalition of Palestinian NGOs, trade unions and civil society groups put a call to boycott Israel until three demands are met. The right of return happens. Palestinian civilians, citizens in Israel get equal rights, and an end to the occupation. this is what the Palestinians want. It's not unreasonable. It's in line with their rights, their legal rights. And it's when people are talking about boycotting Israel, that's what it's for. It's for those three very, very reasonable things. Supporters of Israel will have very often criticised the boycott movement. I spent a large part of the last 10 years listening to people talk about that. The argument's usually, what about X, which is always a weak argument. What about is always a weak argument. And there's always like an insinuation that the reason why people are only calling for a boycott of Israel, not other countries, is because of anti-Semitism. It's like framed as like a hypothetical question, like, oh, why don't you boycott X? Well, the reason is there hasn't been a call by anybody else, right? There are comparable situations, right? Like China is colonizing Tibet, Turkey in, the Kurdish areas in the southwest, Morocco in the Western Sahara, not exactly the same, but, comparable. During the occupation of Iraq, Britain probably should have been boycotted over that, right? But you can't go ahead and boycott a country unless you're asked to. In South Africa, very comparable situation. The ANC specifically called for a boycott. The Palestinians have done, and they have specific rules of how it operates. There's a website. It will be linked below. I'm showing some of it now. It's a boycott of the state, not of individuals. Like, one of my favourite bands is Big Thief. Their bass player is Israeli. It's not of people. It's of states, of companies, of institutions that are linked to the state, and it has very reasonable goals. And it's why, it's why of all of the things around the world, from the point of view of the UK, you can do more. You can have more impact. There is a call to action, like the Uyghurs in China are severely oppressed. What do you do? I don't know. You can. I'm sure there's some things, but it's not as effective as what you can do for Palestine. By all means, march now. Be active now. Go on the marches, sign the petitions, call for the ceasefire, everything like that. But boycott Israel. The link will be down below of the limits of it and the rules of engagement that the Palestinians have developed. During this period as well, there is a Palestinian election for the PA. Hamas wins, but isn't allowed to govern because America likes to spread democracy, but if you vote for the wrong people, then you aren't allowed to have that result honoured. I'm not going to be out here just saying Hamas is amazing. It's not. I've already condemned the attack on the music festival, and I will do so again. And they've done lots of other terrible things. I'm not a Hamas supporter, but they're not quite how they're made out in the media. Ideologically, they're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're Islamists. They're very conservative, obviously, but their brand of Islamism is one that is ideologically wants to work within existing political frameworks and believes in nation states and things like that. They're not Wahhabists. They're not ISIS. They're not Al Qaeda. They have rational goals. They have a charter that is horrible and anti-Semitic, as everybody knows, but changing that is up for negotiation with them. They have said many times that they would recognise Israel if a real deal was on the table. They haven't done so already because they saw the PLO play their hand early and get nothing for it. It's not intractable. If Israel was to do the things that it needs to do, that the Palestinians have a right to, Hamas would go along with it. They have said so many times. And that's worth pointing out. They were not allowed to become the main player in the PLO. That led to an internal war and the current stalemate where Hamas rules Gaza and the PA, without a actual mandate that's dominated by Fatah, operates in the West Bank. The wall, the apartheid wall, is built during this period, ostensibly to stop suicide bombing. You will not be, as everybody knows, it does not go along the legal lines of the border between the occupied territories and Israel. It's a land grab. It's as far east as it can be without taking any people in. Like, part of my time there was protests against the wall, where villages who were farmers were just cut off from their farming land completely. It was just a land grab. That starts to be built during this period. So these are the things that happened during the second Intifada. My first visit there was kind of in the tail end of the second Intifada. I first went there at the end of 2007 for 6 months, and I'm going to kind of just talk about my experiences now. And I was in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I didn't go to Gaza. I was going to go to Gaza at one point, but didn't come off. But I can't describe how horrific I found it. You drive through the West Bank and like the symbols of it's so suffocating and oppressing. It's a small space and you're in a taxi going from like one village or town to another, and there's just checkpoints, there's settlements, there's military installations everywhere. I mean, as a visitor, I obviously could leave or whatever. I can't imagine being there constantly. Since 1967, people have lived under military occupation, the longest one in the world, with their every move monitored, just not able to escape from the network of control that exists over every point of their lives. There are various different points that people talk about. The checkpoints, these are set up everywhere. Sometimes it can be very, very long to get through. I think they're less of an issue now, I think, because the second Intifada in the West Bank has died down a bit. Now things are kicking off in Gaza, things are kicking off in the West Bank. They're probably worse. Basic violations of people's rights to freedom of movement, and the stories you hear. I mean, there's somebody I know. I'm going to put a thing now. His daughter has cerebral palsy because his wife gave birth in an ambulance waiting at a checkpoint, which wasn't let through, and soldiers fired a bunch of tear gas at the ambulance, and that's why his daughter has cerebral palsy. For a long time, Palestinian workers in Israel, or Palestinian workers in the West Bank would go into Israel to work and would have to queue hours, like every single morning at 4 a.m. to kind of get in and out of the city that you live in. Horrific. People don't have any rights. The apartheid analogy that supporters of Israel will fight against by saying, but the Palestinians get to vote, blah, blah, blah. In the occupied territories, they don't. It's a completely different legal system. They have a different legal system. They have no legal rights. They have a different road system. They have far fewer access to all of the resources. Desmond Tutu said that this is apartheid. Nelson Mandela has said it. It's separate. You've got the settlers who have everything, who have access to all of the rights that any Israelis do, living right next to people who have legally in every capacity like separate lives with far fewer rights. They can be arrested at will, just like kind of another tactic learnt from the British of just indefinite detention. You can be arrested for no reason, thrown in jail for months on end with no charges, nothing. Happens all the time. One of the grossest things is Israeli firing regulations, and this is kind of why the group that I was part of was there, because they're different when Israelis and internationals are present. So I'd go to a lot of demonstrations, because if there's a group of Palestinians, Israeli army firing, demonstrating, Israeli army firing regulations just they can do what they want, kill whoever you like, shoot, live fire, just go for it. There's no legal recourse, no legal law against that. If there's Israelis or people from other countries present, then they are forced to disperse the protest with less than lethal means, which are tear gas, rubber bullets, that kind of thing. So just physically being in a place changes how they are legally entitled to respond, and it shows the legal standing that Palestinians in the occupied territory have, that they can just be shot for no reason for demonstrating. When I was there, I was in a town called Azun, which is a bit north of Ramallah, and we were there because the boys in the village would clash with the army quite a lot. They would throw stones at the army vehicles and things like that, and then the soldiers would shoot back, and they'd normally fire rubber bullets or whatever. We were there for months. There were 2 days when the Israeli army just shot the boys with live fire instead, and those were the 2 days we weren't there. That kind of demonstrates that I'm not lying, and it's horrific. Resources, Palestinians have far less access to water, say roads, electricity. In Jerusalem, there's just a slow dispossession, people just having their houses taken. This is another picture of me with somebody who, through a really obscure nonsense bit of legal jargon, was thrown out of his house. We were staying there to try and stop that, and it didn't work. And somebody I had got to know was just made homeless, and settlers were in his house the next day, which was hard. The settlers themselves in the West Bank, as I say, there's 2 types of settlements. There's the big government sponsored ones, which are you don't tend to come across, actually meet the people that live there, but the ideologically driven ones are horrific. They will constantly do whatever they can to harass and attack Palestinians, and have complete, real carte blanche from the Israeli army to do so. Part of what we were doing over there was going with Palestinians when farming their land, because settlers would just come and just start throwing stones at them with impunity. They're often not even Israeli. They're the most ideological Jewish people from around the world who really get into the idea of colonising the whole of Palestine and then leave New York to go and live on a random hill in the West Bank for some reason. Their attacks are regular. And as I say, the settlements as a whole break up the West Bank so that travel between the areas is really difficult, and creates this Bantustan, which is what Israel is the only thing that it wants to offer. In Jerusalem itself, the hardcore settlers want to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and build the 3rd Jewish temple. This would start World War III, and Israel does know this, and there's no plan from the official Israeli state to do so. But there's a slow process. They are slowly pushing Palestinians in the old city out, have done since '67, slowly pushing people in the surrounding areas out. There's, in the names of archaeology, digging tunnels under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which has made it far less stable, and there have been subsidence and things like that. Again, it's just a slow ethnic cleansing, a slow colonisation, until Jerusalem is completely Israeli. The process of collective punishment that we're seeing in Gaza has existed since the 70s, since the whole occupation has existed and is applied everywhere. During the Second Intifada, when there was more violent resistance in the West Bank, you'd seeing the kind of collective punishment responses that you're seeing in Gaza now. like in the West Bank too. The whole situation adds up to apartheid, which is what Desmond Tutu said, which is why it's totally fine to boycott Israel, even if you don't boycott any other country. Gaza is even worse. I mean, I haven't been to Gaza. It was cut off when I was there, and but it's a horror of unimaginable proportions, even before like this attack. Since Hamas was elected and then not allowed to govern the whole of the PA and took over Gaza, this was actually a year after Israel pulled its settlers out of Gaza. Gaza is not an area of land that they're particularly interested in. Since then, it's just become an open-air prison. This has been 15 years now. It's just been an open-air prison. Israeli army regularly fly over it and do sonic booms with their aircraft just to break people's windows. They shoot the fishermen who try to go anywhere near out and take all of the what little resources there are. And sorry, I'm losing my throat now. I'm a bit ill. I'm going to read this directly because this sounds like a horrible anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but it's true. This is a quote from the Institute for Middle East Studies. In early 2006, Dov Weidglas, then a senior advisor to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, explained that Israeli policy was designed to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. In 2012, it was revealed that in early 2008, Israeli authorities drew up a document calculating the minimum calorific intake necessary for Palestinians to avoid malnutrition, so Israel could limit the amount of foodstuffs allowed into Gaza without causing outright starvation. That's evil. That's just evil. And that's been the situation for 15 years. On top of wars and bombings and destructions, there were rounds in 2008, 14, and what we're seeing now. And there's raw sewage, power outages, like shortages of everything you can possibly imagine. It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. It's people who were displaced from, were ethnically cleansed from land within Israel proper, and their descendants. 50% of them are children, and they're being. Well, I'm not going to talk about the current situation. We know what's happening now. This is about the history to give people a bit of an understanding. Even with the Palestinian Authority, they're not even talking to them. They haven't been in negotiations for 9 years with the Palestinian Authority. What do they want? I think they want to make things so bad in Gaza that it joins Egypt, that they just leave. They don't want the land, but they want rid of the people for sure. It's the same in the West Bank. They want to squeeze people so that they leave, but it's ramped up to 100 in Gaza. And even if they achieved what they say they're going to say of Hamas, like if they destroyed Hamas, it would, the power vacuum would be filled by people way more extreme, way more worse for Israel. Again, I'm not out here swinging for Hamas, but like they do, one of the things they do is crack down on like Al-Qaeda types in there. If they were gone, it's not going to go well for Israel. Israel just needs to accept that it needs to do its duties, its responsibilities, and make a peace deal, because all of the power is in its hands. It is the colonizer. It's the occupier. It's the one that has responsibilities. The other side has accepted theirs, including, as I say, Hamas, who've said that they would accept a deal that was acceptable to the Palestinian people. But there's not been any pressure on them. They have the unwavering support of Western governments, and we need to make the BDS movement take off. If there's going to be freedom for Palestine, it's going to be a mixture of Palestinians resisting and people from outside in solidarity. If you're horrified by, what you see, boycott Israel. All of the things are below. On a political note, the other option to the two-state solution is the one-state solution, and that is the establishment of a binational state in the entirety of historic Palestine, like Belgium, but hopefully better than Belgium. Support for this has been growing with Palestinians in recent years as they realise that Israel is not going to give them their state. The BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, it's not one state or two state. It's about rights-based. If those rights, the three inalienable rights, the right of return, end of the occupation, equal rights for Palestinian citizens in Israel, can be realised in the two-state, the formula that there is consensus around the world on, that Israel's refusing to accept, fine. If it's within the one state, fine. The main thing is to, as I say, as a person on the outside, now, especially now that you know the history, is agitate now, but continue to boycott Israel. Thank you.